All right, everyone. We are going to continue reading from chapter 24, which got interrupted last night when I was reading. So I'm going to pick up from there and read for a little bit. When I turned the light on in my old bedroom, a mouse scurried across the floor and disappeared under the twin bed. Nothing was out of place. The bed was made up with the faded daisy quilt I used to hide under with a flashlight to read stolen copies of her geology magazines, scouring them for tidbits that might impress her or something I could ask her, anything to engage her attention. She came alive when she talked about minerals, and sometimes we even went on rock hunts, scouting the wilderness for days on our geology adventures. I opened the closet, pulled out the drawers, and found nothing except a few rocks here and there, which, when I held them up to the light and ran a finger over the waxy surfaces I found, were all agates. Turning to go upstairs, I glanced at Lucas's face and stopped dead. What? I glanced at the spot where he was staring. A faded picture on the wall of a cliff and a man dangling off the edge by one hand. "Believe," it said in thick black letters underneath the image. I'd never been sure what I was supposed to believe by looking at that picture. That he was strong enough to hold on, that the cliff wouldn't crumble, or that his grip would eventually give out, that no matter how capable he was, he couldn't hold on forever. I looked back at Lucas, who'd gone as pale as the petals of the daisies on the bedspread. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Walking to the bed, he sat down on the pillow and stared at the picture again, now directly in front of him. Then he craned his neck to take in every detail of the room. There wasn't much to see, and nothing to justify his sudden agitation. No. He ejected himself off the mattress and ran to the door, leaning into the frame as his breathing became ragged. "Lucas, what?" I pulled his arm, and then, when that had no effect, shook him as hard as I could, suddenly angry for no reason I wanted to name. His eyes bounced around the cabin, unable to settle, and he lifted his hands to squeeze his head, heaving air in and out, manifesting all the signs of a panic attack. I tried to pull his arms down and get him to look at me when he began chanting and shaking violently. One broken "No, no, 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 no." "Lucas, it was here." He broke away, lunging back into the great room and pacing the edges like a caged animal. "What are you talking about? What was here?" "I was." He stopped dead, lifting his shocked face to mine. We stared at each other across the room as I tried to make sense of the words, but what he was saying was impossible, a delusion. When I moved toward him, he jerked back, ducking away. "I don't understand. My father and we were here. This is where I was sick. That guy hanging off the cliff in the picture. I remember it." He swung an arm toward my bedroom before his eye caught on a dust-covered picture frame orphaned on a corner table. Grabbing it, he wiped the dirt off and stared at the unsmiling woman and girl. My dad had taken the photo, not 50 feet from where we were standing. She told me the cliff was made out of salt, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. A mountain of salt. A dawning horror began to clench my body, gripping me, choking me. I couldn't feel my feet. The fish we'd eaten for lunch began moving in my stomach, threatening to swim back up my throat. I stepped closer until the woman in the picture snapped sickeningly into place. "Basalt," I whispered. "The cliff was made out of basalt." Tears spilled down his cheeks as he looked at me. It wasn't Heather Price's body. Chapter 25. I didn't remember falling to the floor or clawing at the sudden burst of pain in my abdomen. One minute Lucas was across the room. The next he was prying my fingers off my side, his face too close, the breaking glass of the picture frame still echoing against the walls of the cabin. He knelt in front of me, pleading, sucking all the oxygen from the air. It was too much. I pushed him off and scrambled as far away as I could, wedging my body into a corner of the kitchen and holding a hand in the air, a warning. Still kneeling, the entire story poured out of him, all the thoughts and feelings I've been so patiently working to get him to reveal, and to which now I could barely force myself to listen. When Lucas had been brought to Congdon and met me, he said he began fighting a war with his memories. I'd reminded him of the woman who'd nursed him when he was so sick as a child, the pale lady with long brown hair who questioned him about his symptoms while reading a little book. The same little book, I realized, my mother had borrowed from Harry, the Merck medical manual. She laid cool rags on his forehead and told him about the salt cliff. She stared at him from the end of the bed and didn't reply when he asked for his father, making him squeeze his eyes shut and wait for her to leave. One night, after he'd begun to feel better, he'd heard noises on the stairs and crouched behind the door as his father carried a body outside. The car engine started. Headlights flashed across the living room, and he never saw the woman again. 10 years later, when he barely remembered what she looked like, I'd walked into his isolation room. He didn't make the connection immediately, not until I brought the minerals and began explaining them, forcing his mind back to the bedrock of his life in the Boundary Waters, the reason for their disappearance. That's when it clicked, when the horrible connection was forged. I know you. Every time he saw me after that was torture. He felt drawn to me, compelled to confess and find out who I was, yet afraid at the same time, trusting nothing and no one in the place that had stolen his every freedom. He began to think Congdon knew about the body, and they deliberately planted me to get him to hand over his father. Ward, too, had no shortage of paranoia, and some of it had worked its way into his mind as the strange noises kept him awake every night, never knowing what the next day would bring. It culminated on the day I took him into the grounds, when he thought I was tricking him into betraying the only person he loved. It wasn't until he woke up in the hospital and saw the picture of Heather Price that he questioned his own memories. He'd been so sick when it happened, hallucinating about bugs in the sky, mountains of salt. Maybe he'd hallucinated more than he'd thought, and layered on top of the doubt was certainty, a bone-deep certainty that he'd known the woman in the picture on his hospital table. He'd seen his dad fighting with her, and whoever she wasn't me. He was overcome with the need to find me, away from the eyes and ears of Congdon, and when he did, the details I gave him about Heather's death made sense, the timing, the overdose, in a way that made him believe. That's why I went to your house when I escaped from the hospital. He inched closer, and I jerked back, knocking my head into the cupboard. His face contorted and he sat down, keeping his distance as he explained, looking through my house that night for anything he might recognize, even trying to find the mountain of salt picture he thought he'd seen. It became obvious he'd never been to my house before, and he convinced himself that I looked like someone who'd only been a figment of his fevered imagination. That's when he told me what he'd witnessed. That's when he asked for my help finding his father. The words rolled over my head, landing in some distant part of the cabin. I heard the tremor in his voice, the rush of air as the explanations tumbled out, one on top of the other, as if any of it could change what my brain was still working to grasp. Harry's story had shocked me enough. To think about my mother here with another man and child was already as much revelation as I could handle. I'd been reeling from the idea that my mother had replaced me, that she'd found happiness with a new family. She hadn't adopted a new family and run away to a better life. A new family had murdered her and escaped into the wilderness. That's why her rocks stopped coming. It wasn't because I was inadequate or worthless. She hadn't forgotten me or moved on. She was dead. She was dead, and so was the insane dream that someday I would see her again, that she would find her way back to us and we could start over. I'd imagined her walking into the bathroom I'd remodeled and seeing how I'd made it into the Boundary Waters, how it would be a place she could thrive and she'd never again have to feel like the soft rock crushed beneath the weight of overpowering forces. My mother was dead. I didn't know you had this cabin. How could I? As if he didn't understand the world had stuttered to a halt, that nothing he could possibly say would matter now. He was babbling, creeping toward me again, his face etched in a bald, unbearable need for sympathy. He wanted my sympathy. I pushed myself off the kitchen floor and ran toward the front door. Wait! Lucas caught me before I could escape, and we fought in a silent struggle of hands and arms, his grasping mine trying to wrench themselves free. You let him take her. I threw blind elbows and heels behind me, thrashing against his grip. You let him get away with it. Maya, please, stop. He grunted as I landed a blow to his gut, but the jab doubled me over, too, reverberating back into my muscles and setting fire to the stitches in my side. We fell into the counter like one creature, tangled beyond separation in our rage and grief and pain. I clutched the bandage that had become slippery against my skin and tried to control the sobs that began heaving through my chest, because if I let them out, I didn't know if they would ever stop. Lucas, I choked out, but a flash of movement through the kitchen window killed any other words in my throat. A car turned off the highway and pulled through the trees into the driveway. A police cruiser. I stumbled back and looked wildly around the cabin. My heart, already abused beyond repair, kicked into a sprint. Every room on the main floor had at least one window, and there was no basement, which left only one place to hide. Locking the front door, I ran to the stairs and was halfway up before I remembered. The picture frame, the light, I hissed, and we flew back down. I hit the light switch off in my bedroom, and Lucas shoved the broken frame under a couch as the sound of a slamming door echoed in the front yard. We rushed back up the stairs that creaked and groaned with every step, dove to the loft floor, and lay side by side on the scratchy carpet littered with mouse droppings, reining in our breath, listening. The rap on the door sent a jerk through my entire body. Silence. Then another knock. No voices. The upstairs loft was open on three sides, with only a railing gating the platform from the rafters. If we crawled to any of the edges, we would see what was happening on the first floor, but then anyone on the first floor could see us. After a long pause, one of the living room windows rattled, and a beam of light glanced off the rough beams of the ceiling. They were circling the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of life, signs of us. We listened as they worked their way along the foundation, crunching leaves underfoot, shining flashlights through the main level, and even illuminating the headboard of the loft bed, so close that we could see the dust motes spinning in the air. At one point, when the silence stretched out and it was impossible to tell where they were or what they were doing, Lucas reached out and covered my hand. I squeezed my eyes and gulped back the silent convulsions in my chest. I could feel his warmth next to me, his absolute stillness, save the fingers that pressed into mine, offering what he could never articulate, not even if we had the world to ourselves and all the languages in it. And I had no choice but to twist my hand into his, gripping the very thing that had shattered me. After another minute, we heard a branch snap in the distance. Lucas rose up and crawled silently to the tiny second floor window to peek outside. There's two of them. They're following our tracks back to Harry's house. I still couldn't move. Lucas watched from the shadows, eyes trained on the neighboring property. It doesn't look like Harry's answering the door. They're walking around to his house too. A pause. Waiting. Now they're back in the driveway. They're looking at the cars. One of them is wiping the snow off the back of ours. They're running the license plate. I covered my face, trying to steady my breath. If Butch hadn't come home and reported his car missing yet, there wouldn't be an immediate link. We might have a few hours, a day tops, before they put the pieces together and got a warrant. They'd find me, arrest me, and send me where I'd been headed before Condon had stepped in all those years ago and postponed the uninvitable. At least my mother would never know. She'd never have to witness what her daughter had become. They're coming back now. One of them is on the phone. I wiped my leaking eyes, fighting for control. Lucas, fixated on the threat outside, kept narrating the policeman's progress in a low whisper. One was taking a photo. The other came back to a ground floor window and tried peering inside again. Turning away from the bouncing flashlight beam, I caught a glimpse of something under the bed. An object that, in one swift moment, wiped every tremor from my body and left behind a piercing calm. The police car's engine fired to life in the driveway on the other side of the house. Go check, make sure they're both leaving together. Lucas obeyed without question, creeping silently across the carpet and down the stairs. As soon as his head disappeared below the floor of the loft, I reached underneath the bed and I pulled out the gun. We hurried back to Harry's house, this time pulling pine branches behind us to obliterate our tracks. Lucas kept a cautious distance from me. We'd spoken little since the cops left, and then only the logistics. When it was safe to come out, how long we'd have until they'd be back, our next steps. The magnitude of what just happened in the cabin haunted every look, but the police hunt snapped us back to the present danger. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should go alone, he said as we made our way through the trees. I'm coming. But you're still. I'm coming. Gaze forward. I felt the weight of the gun bumping my hip with every step. The missing gun from the boathouse. The one I'd desperately been searching for the day I'd come here with Derek and Rex. I finally found it. My mind raced with reasons it had been moved, and every version circled back to the same basic motivation. She felt scared and wanted to protect herself. A decade later, the gun lay unused under her bed, and her body was rotting wherever Josiah Blackthorne had dumped it. As we approached the house, Harry appeared in the woods coming up from the lake, carrying strings of charred brown fish. He waved them at me. How's about some smoked trout chowder? The police were here, Harry. I glanced down the hill, gauging the distance of his fish house to the main cabin. It was possible he hadn't heard them, especially since they'd walked over instead of driving. He didn't comment on it, didn't even seem interested that the police had been here. Instead, he pulled open the cabin door and let it thwack against the siding. Come on, you can chop some onions. The pain started getting the better of me as we helped Harry prepare dinner, so I changed the bandage and took half a pill. I didn't want to be foggy or jeopardize the absolute clarity the gun had given me, but I also couldn't be crumpled in pain on the couch while Lucas disappeared into the wilderness either. He might suspect enough to never emerge again. I peeked around the blanket hanging over the front window every 90 seconds and stopped cold whenever I heard an engine in the distance. We go tonight after Harry's asleep, I murmured as we set the table, my attention deliberately focused on laying spoons one by one at each chair. Lucas paused, holding chipped mugs of water. He wanted me to look at him, to let him in, but I couldn't. Finally, after I took the water out of his hands and finished the place settings, he whispered, I don't know where we are in relation to him. That turned out to be no problem. Harry was happy to produce a tattered old Boundary Waters map as we ate chowder, pointing out his favorite fishing spots. Lucas studied our location and let his eyes move over the terrain, jumping from lake to lake, finding our route. He nodded almost imperceptibly after handing it back, while I stirred the congealing contents of my bowl. The food was good, but I had no appetite, no interest in anything besides the comfort of metal against my ankle. The gun, which I transferred to my boot in the bathroom, had absorbed so much body heat that now it was warming me. After dinner, we moved to the couch, Harry relaxing on one side while Lucas and I sat rigidly on the other. Harry flipped the TV on, and we watched a reality show that I absorbed absolutely nothing from, instead watching the clock with obsessive focus and waiting for Harry to get tired. As soon as the show ended, the local news came on. My entire body jumped as Lucas's face filled the screen. Still no word tonight in the missing persons case of Lucas Blackthorne. Blackthorne, who was rescued from the Boundary Waters after being presumed dead for the last 10 years, was kidnapped from Condon Psychiatric Facility, where he had been recuperating since his now famous return to society. Authorities believe this woman, my Condon badge picture flashed on the screen, complete with extra spiky maroon hair and deadpan eyes, is responsible for removing the patient in the middle of the night, injuring a guard, and destroying some hospital property in the process. The screen flipped to the news anchor, but both our pictures hovered over her shoulder, refusing to fade away. A substantial reward is being offered for any information that can lead to Lucas Blackthorne's recovery. Please call this number at the bottom of the screen or contact your local authorities. They moved to the next story, which was weather. They always opened with the weather. Why hadn't they opened with the freaking weather? I could have reacted then, made Harry change the station before it was too late. I felt Lucas looking at me, but my eyes were glued to Harry. He'd sat motionless through the whole thing, legs sprawled, fingers linked across his flannel shirt. Another story passed, then another. I kept waiting for him to say something, but he was like a statue, hermit in repose, and no hint of what he was thinking crossed his face. At the first commercial break, Harry finally broke his position and sat up tall, reaching his arms toward the ceiling in an exaggerated stretch. Was I crazy, or was he refusing to make eye contact with us? Well, I'm to bed. Harry, I started, and not knowing what would come next. He stood up and nodded vaguely toward us as we sat frozen on the couch, waiting for him to get a move. Get some rest, Maya. You need your energy. I couldn't tell if he was offering to protect us or trying to get out of the room so he could make the call that would send us tumbling into the bowels of the world. Lucas back to Congdon and me to prison. Harry, it's not what it looks like. He chuckled, flipping the TV off. To hear us better from his room? Looks like a couple of nervous kids in trouble. I could have told you that when you staggered in here yesterday. Rest up, okay? And then he was gone, shuffling to his bedroom at the end of the hall. He shut the door, but his light stayed on. I turned to Lucas, who looked as unsure as I felt. We have to go. Now. Chapter 26. We crept through Harry's house as quietly as possible, folding the bedding and stacking it on the couch, getting our cold weather gear from the car, and changing into it. Lucas filled up our water bottles while I retrieved all the bloody bandages from the trash and bagged up every other trace of our stay I could find. Right before we left, I laid $300 on the kitchen table. It was nowhere near the substantial reward he would have received, but it was all I had, and I wanted him to know I was grateful for his help, no matter what he thought of us now. When everything was ready, I climbed into the car and put it in neutral so Lucas could push us out of the driveway. He threw his weight into it, and we started rolling, crunching quietly on the gravel, until Lucas snapped upright and shouted a warning. I whipped around and saw a figure standing directly in our path. Slamming on the brakes, I stopped the car inches before we collided. Our brake lights illuminated the person's face. It was Harry. I shifted into park and gave Lucas a warning look before sliding out and bracing my weight against the door panel. Harry wore a dark robe and slippers and held something in his hand. He wasn't smiling or moving out of our way. You might need this. What is it? I didn't move either. Something for a journey. Lucas stepped up to my side, and we both scanned the black horizon, listening. The snow was powdery enough to muffle any footsteps anyone approaching from the sides or stationed behind the house. Stay here, I whispered, and walked to the end of the car where Harry stood holding a knife. The gun was still tucked in my boot, but before I could decide whether to pull it out, Lucas cut in front of me, shielding me from Harry. Hey! Harry held his hands up and retreated a step. If I meant harm, I would have done it when you were sleeping, right? You didn't know our situation until an hour ago, I reminded him. He laughed now, his deep, thoughtful Harry laugh. I hate to disappoint you kids, but his mug, he waved at Lucas, who stepped back and scanned the edges of the clearing again, has been on the news more times than tonight, and most people go to a hospital when they've been skewered, unless they're running from something worse than the hole in the side. I forced a half smile as my fight or flight reflexes slowly relaxed. I hoped you'd chalk it up to nostalgia. Yeah, lot of good memories here for you, Maya. He snorted and then switched his hold on the knife so it was lying flat in both his palms, pushing it toward us, and offering. This'll cut anything from rope to animal hide, and it's got a pliers, a carabiner, and a can opener on it, too. My father gave it to me just before he died. He built this place, you know. Anyway, maybe it'll help you find your way to his dad. Reckon that's where you're headed. He flipped all the attachments out and in as he named them, then handed the knife to me. Harry, my throat started to close. No, he objected when I tried to give it back and patted my hand awkwardly, like someone tolerating their friend's dog, or like a solitary man forcing out of his isolation by bleeding, self-involved children. You keep it. He stared at me for a second, and it felt like he was digging the stitches out of my stomach, snapping them one by one and uncovering the clotted mess inside. Be not simply good. Be good for something, right? Turning to shuffle toward the house, he added, "Next time I see you, you better not be covered in blood." I shook my head at the knife, glowing red in the taillights. "Blood happens, Harry. I can't make any promises." We drove a mile down the highway, passing my mother's cabin and killing the lights to pull into a curved, paved road on the opposite side of her property. This cabin wasn't a cabin at all. A hulking black building emerged from the woods as we coasted down the driveway, its roof reaching up to swallow the star-filled sky. I'd never seen it from this angle, day or night, but I still remember the floor-to-ceiling lakeside windows that looked like gaping eyes when we paddled past. During our summers here, this mansion was owned by a pair of retired doctors, snowbirds who split their time between the Northwoods and the dry burn of Tuscan in the winter. I had no idea if they left for the year or if they even still owned the place, but the windows were dark. No smoke came from the chimneys. It was as good a place as any to leave Butch's car. Bumping over the narrow path that wound down toward the lake, I parked in the massive shadow of their boathouse, which was roughly the size of Harry's entire cabin. I glanced up the hill. No movement behind the gaping eyes, then checked the weather on the burner, since it might be the last time we'd have any cell service. Clear sky tonight with a low of 19 degrees. We'll have sun tomorrow morning, then a snowstorm moving in during the afternoon. Low visibility. Good cover. I had Lucas backtrack to the highway and obscure our tire marks while I checked the supplies. 2 changes of thermal clothes rated for sub-zero temperatures, tent, sleeping bag, fire starters, water filtration, enough protein bars and trail mix to last us a week, a first aid kit, and a 9mm. I wrapped a gun in an extra shirt and sealed it in a watertight bag. If the canoe tipped, it would be safer there than in my boot. By the time Lucas got back, I'd already strapped on my pack and cinched the waistband tight to alleviate the pull on the stitches. I pointed to his and set out hiking through the moonlit white woods, knowing he would catch up in seconds. We walked silently along the lake shore, staying in the shadows of the trees, even though not a soul, human or animal, was out on this frigid night. Our breath made clouds in the air, and my clouds grew faster, smaller, as we approached a clearing near the shore. "Have you been here since?" Instinctively, Lucas moved closer to my side. I shook my head and kept moving, focused only on the snow-dusted shack and the rickety door that shrieked when I tried to open it. Lucas reached in, and together we muscled the old wood open and pulled out the canoe. "How's your side?" Lucas asked as we carried the boat down to the rocks toward the water. "What about it?" I gritted my teeth. Thank God for Kevlar. I doubted I could have held up my end of an aluminum canoe right now. Wordlessly, he leaned down to break the ice forming at the water's edge. It was only a few millimeters thick, but that could change in a single night. If the water cooled enough, an entire lake could form an ice sheet before sunrise. I dropped my pack in the canoe and made myself walk back into the dark opening of the boathouse for the life jackets and paddles. They hung in the same place they always had, on hooks along the door. I grabbed them and retreated as quickly as I could, crashing into Lucas. He caught me when I stumbled, but his focus was on something over my shoulder. "What's that?" All I saw were shadows. He took the flashlight from me and shined it at the base of one of the studs, where a glint of light sparkled against the rotting wood. I stepped inside, and my breath caught as I registered what it was. Oh my God. Scooping it up, I let the pendant dangle from the tarnished, rusting chain, the agate slice, the necklace I'd brought when Derek, Rex, and I had driven to the cabin searching for the mother I hadn't known was dead. Months later, after I'd been released from Congdon and details began mattering again, I realized it had somehow vanished during the attack, and I'd never considered returning to search for it. Maybe Rex had taken it before he disappeared, or maybe it had fallen into the water and washed away. I traded the 2 rocks in my head, an agate lost for an agate found, and refused to let myself look back. But here it was in the rotting boathouse, waiting for me after all these years. Was it hers? I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Pulling it over my head, I tucked the pendant under my clothes, where it made a frozen circle on my chest. I pressed a hand to the spot. Ready? Maya, I don't know if you've healed enough for this. It's this or prison. I gave him a paddle, life jacket, and an impossible choice. Where do you want me to go? He stepped closer, and even in the moonlight I could see him struggle. I know what I'm asking of you, okay? But you've got to believe me. He's not a bad man. Neither of us know what happened that night. We weren't there, and I don't think he was ever able to talk about it with me. But that's my job. I stepped into the canoe and braced myself. I help people find their voices. The boundary water somehow, somewhere in the middle of the lake, we crossed the threshold that divided one world from another, where human saturation gave way to one of the last great wildernesses in the country. Everything was covered with a layer of white, snow weighing down the branches of the pines that stood sentinel, the only witnesses to our silent progress. Our oars dipped in time, me in the bow, Lucas in the stern, steering us toward the main portage of this lake, a northward path that fed into another winding body of water. Paddling turned out to be worse than hiking. The twist of muscle in my abdomen screamed every time I pulled the oar, and I bit my lip with each stroke, riding the edge of pain and wishing I'd broken down and taken another pill. While my insides burned, my skin froze wherever it was exposed, and even my fingers began numbing through the gloves. It felt like an hour before we reached the portage, and as soon as the canoe nosed the bank, I splashed out, cracking through the ice and looking for a foothold to drag the bow up as far as I could. Lucas was right behind me, and before I could put distance between us, his arms encircled me. Rest, he whispered in my ear. Warm up, I can tell you're hurting. As much as I craved his warmth, it was impossible to let myself take it. Pulling away, I lifted my pack out of the boat and dug through it. Here, modern technology to the rescue. I gave him a set of hand warmers and slipped another pair into my own gloves, glancing at the yawning darkness between the trees. Packs first and then back for the canoe. But Lucas was already putting his pack on backward, over his stomach, and flipping the boat up without any help, balancing the yoke on his shoulders. Grabbing my own pack, I ducked out of the way and turned the flashlight on. Too bright, he muttered, and I could hear the hurt from my rebuff slinking into the woods with him. You can see that a mile away. So I followed blindly into the black, walking behind his boat balancing shadow, while he whispered warnings of rocks and roots. As my eyes adjusted, I could see spots of ground through the snow, other tracks besides ours, which were too big and too evenly spaced to be anything but human. The Boundary Waters was open year-round, and winter campers came for ice fishing and dog sledding. But I couldn't imagine who would be here now, in the transition between seasons, when paddling became a dangerous gamble. You could get trapped in the middle of nowhere if a sudden freeze made the lakes unpassable. You could tip your canoe and fall into water with a temperature barely above freezing, water so cold that it sucked you down like Superior, and maybe you would drown, or maybe you'd crawl your way out into hypothermia. Either way, there was no help waiting for you. There was no 911 here, no phones, no outposts, no emergency services. There was 1,000 ways to die in the Boundary Waters, and all of them were alone. When we reached the next lake and emerged from under the canopy, the moon felt like a spotlight, 100 times brighter than it had been before. I'd looked for tracks again, but they were gone. We loaded up and pushed out into a smaller channel lined with collapsed drifts of marsh grass. The ice was thicker here in the shallows, and I punched at it with the oar, breaking a path into the open water around snow-covered boulders. We veered wildly in some places, and not wide enough in others. The canoe scraped the bottom several times, and at one point we lodged on a rock shelf, but not hard enough to ground. I shoved us off the shelf with the paddle, and we tried another path, then another, breaking our way through by trial and error. It seemed to take forever for the channel to widen again, and I wondered if we'd be forced to portage until finally the banks receded, our oars stopped hitting bottom, and we came into a glossy moon mirror of a lake. This one was smaller, and it didn't take us long to paddle to the center, powered by Lucas's long shore strokes. When we reached the middle, I rested my oar across the gunwales and slipped a hand under my coat, gingerly feeling the edges of the bandage. It took a minute to register that Lucas had stopped paddling too. "Look up," Lucas breathed, and I did. Overhead, the cloudless skies showcased thousands of glowing and pulsing stars. As our paddle ripples faded off the surface of the water, the pinpoints of light reflected back from below, and it felt like we were floating in the middle of an endless galaxy. I missed this. I'd forgotten how quiet it was, the total silence of the Boundary Waters. It was nothing like living at the mouth of Superior, which consumed everything in its white noise of wind and waves. And I understood why I hadn't been back here, why I'd never come looking for the necklace. It wasn't fear of a dead man. The dead man found me in my dreams, no matter where I was. I hadn't returned for the same reason Dad couldn't. We didn't want to have this without her. I drew a shaky breath as I gazed from horizon to horizon. "Did you know we're made of stardust?" "Really?" "Cosmic explosions from before time was time." She'd told me. It was written in a note she'd left on my nightstand before she tucked me in my bed, brushed a salty kiss over my forehead, and locked herself in the bathroom to eat 2 bottles of aspirin. "We're molecules of living, breathing stardust, Maya, and just like the rocks, we're all different. Some people are strong and beautiful, and they can withstand glaciers. Others are weak and brittle, and the best thing that we can do is birth a gemstone." She hadn't signed it with a goodbye or any words of advice or regret. There wasn't even a "love, Mom" at the bottom, just a note about stardust before she tried to turn herself back into it. "Then why don't we shine?" Lucas asked, pulling me out of my head. I did. I slid one hand up to touch the agate pendant, making sure it was still there before grabbing the oar and setting my jaw against the fire that was going to start raging in my side. Maybe we're not far enough away to see it. We paddled into a larger lake, and then portaged in a direction I'd never gone. The trail was narrow, steep incline, and the snow made everything more slippery. I fell twice and hit my head on the back of the canoe once. Just when I was about to break down and ask if we could make camp, Lucas froze on the peak of the hill. "What is it?" "Shh." He hoisted the canoe down and propped it on a fallen log, then scanned the perimeter. I held my breath, trying not to make the slightest noise. Finally, he pointed to a spot ahead and to our left. "There." He dropped his pack and cut away from the path, his form disappearing in the trees. "What?" I asked again, and again he shushed me. Sighing, I dropped my pack too, and picked my way behind him through the standing and falling trees. Gradually my eyes adjusted, and I concentrated on Lucas's feet, watching where his heels landed and putting my boots in the same spots. When we scaled logs, he helped me over, and I was too weak to resist. We hiked for at least 10 minutes, to the point where I started panicking we'd lose our way back to the canoe. Was he leading me to his father, to their hidden campsite? I'd left a gun in the pack and had no idea how to find my way to it alone. Then a familiar scent cut through the woods, and I lifted my head to see a faint, flickering light eclipsed by Lucas's silhouette. We slowed down and approached cautiously, using the muffling effects of snow to our advantage. "Too goddamn early to be breaking camp. You're insane." "I want to get a jump on today before the storm hits. No chance of finding Blackthorn in a whiteout." That drew a groan from the other person. I leaned carefully around a tree trunk and tried to count heads at the campsite, which was still a good 200 feet away. Lucas crept even farther up and crouched behind a boulder. I was calculating the risk of trying to join him when a familiar voice spoke up. "We're not going to find shit until sunrise anyway, which is still an hour away." The voice belonged to Micah, the U.S. Forest Service ranger who'd volunteered to be part of the Congdon search party, the veteran who had no problem with crazy people. He'd been at all the planning meetings and had kept in contact with Dr. Mita even after the expedition had fallen through. I could only see one other head beside his, crouched near the fire. The rangers talked for a few more minutes, discussing routes and lakes. I couldn't tell, though, which blackthorn they were looking for. Did these two represent the search party Dr. Mita had assured me was still looking for Josiah, or had they been alerted of the kidnapping and sent to find and arrest us? As I tried to get a better look at the man tending the fire, Micah stood up and walked straight toward us. I ducked behind the tree as the crunch of snow and pine needles became louder and louder. Holding my breath, pulling my legs in, I pressed myself into the base of the tree trunk. Silence. Then came the sound of a zipper and a thick stream of urine hitting the ground. I closed my eyes and waited until he finished and moved back to camp. I heard the bang of a pot on the grate just as Lucas appeared at my side. I touched my ear and pointed to the men, but he pointed in the opposite direction, making a gesture I didn't understand. I shook my head. He pointed away again and leaned in until his mouth grazed my ear. Now, before it gets lighter. Then he drew me to my feet and we moved like shadows into the fading night. Lucas led us back to the canoe as easily as if we were crossing through my yard to the garage. We didn't speak until we reached the portage trail and stood over our packs. We'll make camp here. We should get farther away, head in the opposite direction of where they talked about going. He moved until he was only inches away, and his fingers caught me in the side, pushing enough to make me wince. You're not going any farther tonight. Then he lifted both packs, one in front and the other on his back, before shouldering the canoe and stepping back onto the trail we'd just made. Anyway, the safest place to be is the site they're leaving. Get a branch and cover our tracks. We waited until they packed and left before setting up a few 100 feet away, close enough to catch a glimpse of the icy water but still well hidden, situating the tent behind a giant fallen pine, jeweled with cones. By the time I crawled inside, the hand warmers had given out and my boots were covered in ice from hauling the canoe in and out of the lakes. We ate and drank without speaking, then rolled out the sleeping bag. Just one? He raised an eyebrow. It's a double, better for body heat. His eyes caught mine in the dim flashlight before skimming down my body. Lay down. Lucas. Now. When I did, he pulled my shirt up and redressed the wound. The soiled bandage had bloodstains mixed with the greenish-tinted fluid that had soaked to the edges of the padding. Neither of us commented on it. Silently, he swabbed the stitches with alcohol, found more clean dressing, and bandaged me with ridiculously tender fingers, as if trying to make amends for poking me on the trail. I blinked at the ceiling of the tent, illuminated by the first fragile morning light, as he smoothed tape over my ribs and tugged the shirt back down. Then he slid carefully to my other side and zipped us both into the bag. There was enough room to sleep side by side, and that's what I should have done. I should have turned as far away as I could, but I was cold and hurting and too weak to resist the warmth of his body. Instinct took over and we curled into each other, fitting our curves into hollows, cushioning bone with flesh. For 8 years I dreaded going to bed, preferring insomnia to the nightmares and ghosts. I'd never spent a night with a live person before. I'd never felt this foreign surge of comfort or experienced the gift of listening to someone else's heartbeat through their chest, and I knew I didn't deserve it. I didn't deserve anything about Lucas Blackthorn, this boy who'd gone from a panicking, violent kid to someone who lovingly redressed wounds in the Arctic down, whose lips were brushing over my hair and whose fingers nestled in the dips between my vertebrae. He should have choked me to death the first day we met. I thought as I drifted into the no man's land between consciousness and sleep, because I was going to avenge my mother. I was going to orphan him. All right, and as usual, like, follow, and comment, and I will reply to your comments, and I'll get the next chapters posted soon.